Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 16th weekly COVID-19 town hall with Dr. Sanjay Udoshi. My name is John Doa, the digital producer for these. Sanjay, our town hall is on week 16, so I guess that means it's old enough to drive.
It is, John. I know. Can you believe it? I was hoping by now that we would be shutting down our little operation here and moving on. But unfortunately, we are still relevant and still here to provide answers to everyone's questions as the pandemic in the United States continues to take its toll on us, both economically and socially, as well as in other ways. But we thank everyone for joining us this evening. And John, thank you very much for continuing to support us and our activities, both here in the town hall and also on Facebook. We do have a list of resources on displayed here on the start screen of the town hall, where you will find information at various levels. So some basic information about me and my background and friends and family can be found under my name, shortened SM Udoshi. Expanded Sanjay Udoshi is our actual page where we are sharing COVID news, education, resources for the general public. And then we have a more specialized resource group, which also includes a number of professionals from the biomedical community and others who are interested in biomedical research and the updated evidence that is being generated by that community as it relates to the treatments, the vaccine development, as well as the epidemiology of COVID, both here in the United States and throughout the world. And if you want to write down that bit.ly shortened or abbreviated URL, you can save that and join the group, please, as well, and the page so that you can get updates on the posts that we've been gathering, curating, as well as the videos that are there for education purposes.
As we look at that, also speaking of the archive and the resources, we're again joined by Karen Hirsch and Terry Munt, who are helping to moderate our discussion. You'll see on your screen, on the toolbar for the webinar, there is a chat feature, which we try not to use so much except for funny banter or posting group resources. If you have a specific question, please use the Q&A panel. You should click on Q&A there, and you just submit a question there, and then we see it and we work it into the conversation. And some of our questions that get very, very, very specific, we will answer, but we hold until the end of the show. And then we have everybody come in as a kind of a group discussion, and we do it there. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature, and back to Sanjay.
Thank you, John. Okay, so what we were discussing last week was the resurgence of COVID, especially throughout the West and the South, and the numbers being very startling at the level we saw last week of 35 to 40,000 new cases per day being detected. We also saw that we discussed a little bit about the mutation of COVID and the possibility that COVID is actually developing a trait that is making it more easily transmissible. And we're going to discuss a little bit more about that today. I've discovered a little bit more about the science behind that. So there will be a kind of a technical discussion of what causes that, because I think that though it may be not necessarily easy to understand for the general public, at the molecular level, I'll try to simplify it to help you understand why this mutation is very significant and why it has occurred now and not earlier, and why this is a kind of a milestone and an indicator of what could eventuate if we allow the current scenario to continue and extrapolate towards worst case scenarios. And so I'm going to cover that. Karen and Terry are here to, as John just described, to help with the discussion, to collate the questions that are coming in through the Q&A. As John described, please use that. And also to help structure the discussion. And so they will stop me as I go along to make sure that I stay on track. And they will also help to interject your questions as we go along here. So what I'll do is I'll start, as I usually do, with a topic screen. So one of the things that we'll discuss today is the discovery of a very significant mutation known as D614G. On the right side of the screen, you see a clay model or a plastic model of the viron, as it's known, in the background with its red spikes that give it the name coronavirus. And in the foreground, you see the actual spike protein expanded as we have developed a 3D model of it as an important part of many efforts to control COVID. It is important for us to understand the molecular basis of its transmission, the molecular basis of its infectivity, and then also this becomes relevant in the development of vaccines. So think of it as a police mugshot. The virus needs to be defined physically so that researchers at various levels in the biomedical community can identify it. And one of the things that is a strong identifier of the virus to your own body is the proteins that are prominently displayed on the outer surface of it. So I'll go into a little bit of what we call morphology of the virus. I'll talk about what you will be hearing in the news regarding the spike protein, the envelope protein, and the internal proteins that cause the virus to replicate within the cell of the body. I wanted you to understand that this infection is not typical when it comes to virus and bacterial infections. This is what we call an intracellular infection. This enters your body's body's cells and replicates itself by using the body's own cellular machinery. This is in contrast to infections that you may have commonly heard of, such as strep, staph, E. coli, and others that are commonly seen causing your sore throats and your skin infections and your GI infections that make people very sick. But the difference is, obviously, this is a virus, those are bacteria. Bacteria do not generally enter your body's cells. They create colonies and secrete toxins that cause the illness. The virus is very different. So because of the changes that are occurring in the virus genome, which is the genetic material that codes for the shape and the behavior of the virus, we're seeing not just because of human behavior, we're also seeing, as a result of the viral mutation, a resurgence of the virus in the United States. So if I were to give weight to the resurgence being caused by either the mutation or the virus itself, or the resurgence being caused by human behavior, I would say 80% of the resurgence and increase in case counts is actually caused by human behavior. Okay, so let's lay that out right away. The fact that people are going out to bars and ignoring mask usage and not physically distancing is really 80% of the cause of this massive new spike in case counts. However, I would credit about 20% of it due to the virus changing its behavior, its morphology in a way that is allowing it to be more transmissible. And we'll talk about how that has eventuated. We talked a little bit about it last week. If Terry remembers the diagrams that I put up, the sticky versus the stiff versus the floppy. I got him to laugh. The stiff versus the floppy, and the sticky parts of the spike protein. That was just initial. Some scientific evidence had been developed, but now we're really getting a clear picture of how that is actually leading to changes in the way that the virus is able to infect. And so we'll cover a little bit about that. Okay, so the really disturbing part of week 16 is that in this country we have absolutely no control of the spread of the pandemic. Also, different states are being affected differently, as we saw in Italy and as we saw in Spain, but for different reasons, and that is mostly human behavior. And so when we have upwards of 35 to 40 to almost 50,000 new cases per day in the United States, any opportunity for contact tracing and any opportunity for mitigation and further control is lost. At these infection levels, we're not just dealing with pandemic issues and epidemiological control of the pandemic, the problems associated with a viral pandemic. We're also dealing with outbreak levels. So an outbreak is really defined as a massive, sudden spread of a infectious agent. And because the United States has never returned to baseline, the outbreak is occurring on top of pandemic levels of infectivity. I hope that's clear. What I mean by that is that the curve was flattened, but flattened at a plateau and not at baseline. Okay, so baseline is 0 to 300, maybe 0 to 1,000 new cases per day. We could call that baseline. All right, that's a level of infectivity that can be, with significant effort, can be mitigated and then further controlled through contact tracing and through the epidemiological methods of isolation and quarantine and things like that. Once you exceed 10,000 per day, you are, you're at the level of a pandemic within the country, and then globally we're seeing, case counts never having fallen below 70,000 per day. So both the United States and collectively the world has failed at control over the pandemic. But within the nations of the world, there are success stories, which we have covered in the past town halls. We've covered how New Zealand, South Korea, to some extent Singapore, but to a great extent Hong Kong, and other nations have, Japan especially, have done the needful and used the diligent methods to safeguard their populations. We count ourselves among countries like Brazil and Russia, who do not have any control over the ravages of the pandemic within their borders, and are actually the ones that are driving the global case count. So not only are we among the worst performing nations, we are also among those driving the global pandemic higher in terms of case counts and positivity. So I would love to have questions and make this conversational. I don't want this to be just me, giving my opinion. Although I do try.
There are a couple people that have asked questions.
Okay, so let me just cover worst case scenarios real quick, and then we'll start taking questions right away.
Okay.
So what I'd like to talk about is, and get your questions on, are the 5 worst case scenarios, which are really described as, our healthcare system, both at the state level and also nationally, eventually being completely overwhelmed. Severe supply chain disruptions, both in the biomedical supply chain, but also in food and other commerce and necessities. So severe disruptions there, which we have not seen so far, thankfully. An economic collapse, which includes the closure of over 60 to 80% of small business with no recovery in sight. Schools closing, both at the state level and then perhaps even, as we saw, national levels of closure in late March, April, and May. Colleges, etc., all institutions of learning being closed and what that means. And then eventually, if things get severe enough, we could see that states will close their borders to other states. So there will be no allowed transit between states that are considered hotspots and states that are not. So these worst case scenarios are some of the things that we're tracking now, and that you can extrapolate to based on the current trends. So with that, love to take questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, we have some good ones. So
Okay.
Chai Bryce, her son and daughter-in-law bought the masks with the valves in the front.
Yes.
And he works as a cook. He doesn't have direct interaction with the public. And she is wondering if these kinds of masks are okay.
Okay. So these masks are highly protective to the wearer. They are not protective in the effort to avoid transmission to others. So what happens is this is a one-way valve. So air entering your respiratory system has to go through the filter. And then air being expelled from you, it doesn't have to travel through the filter. It bypasses the filter. The filter is pushed outward and the air rushes out around it. Okay. So we don't recommend these for use to go shopping and things like that, because if you are an asymptomatic carrier, then it's not doing the job that we hope masks do when you're out doing regular things in the public. When you are working in an environment that may be highly contaminated, and generally, I'm not sure food services qualifies, but definitely healthcare services. So that is protective to the wearer and recommended and useful, and especially for non-clinical healthcare workers. And what I mean by that is people who clean, people who are disinfecting, people who are, helping with all of the logistics of the healthcare environment, but that are not directly dealing with patients. That kind of single way valved filtration mask is useful, and it can be as effective as an N95 if the filter is rated as such. But we don't recommend that you use those if you're going out in public, because the purpose of masking is twofold when you are in public. Obviously, we've covered this before. The important part of masking is, right now especially, is to prevent asymptomatic spread. We know that 40% of those who get infected may actually carry it for up to 14 days without feeling any symptoms. And they may be doing their daily routine and spreading it to others without any, without knowledge of that. So for those people, which means for everyone, potentially everyone, should wear a mask in public. And that mask should not be valved. It should be at least double layered, cloth mask to prevent droplets of 3 to 5 or larger nanometer escaping out past the 3-foot mark, or so that it drops into another person's face, nose, mouth, etc., and that leads to transmission. To the best of our knowledge, this is what we've discovered is the primary route of asymptomatic transmission, and that's why we want non-valved masks to be used.
And then this is a good question also from the same person, because I also have this question. So I always forget to take my multivitamins. So I resorted to buying the multivitamin that's like a chocolate, because then I'll remember to take it.
Okay.
So this is kind of along the same line. Is it better to take a multivitamin that has everything in it? Or is it better to try and take like all of the basic things separately, like zinc, magnesium, vitamin C?
I don't have a scientific answer for that. I would say that you should focus on absorbability, and you should focus on, making sure that you're taking it regularly so that you have adequate levels. So that's what's most important. That's a great question, because every week we have had questions on supplements, and we're actually seeing that certain supplements are very effective in because we've discovered that people with vitamin D3 deficiency, especially for various reasons, do poorly once they get infected. Okay. We've covered this before, that taking D3 or excesses of D3 will not protect you from getting infected. But if you have appropriate levels, of zinc and magnesium and vitamin D, and your body is fully nourished, you will fight the infection more effectively. So just to clarify, taking these supplements will not protect you from getting the infection. It will just make your body more ready to fight. Okay, let's at that leave it at that.
Hey, Karen.
Yeah.
I do get gummy vitamins.
Yes, they're great.
Because I couldn't find adult Flintstone vitamins for myself. So
I have seen the gummy. For me to remember, it had to be chocolate.
Okay. I didn't know they make chocolate vitamins. I love chocolate.
Because they don't help you if you forget, right?
Sure.
So
exactly. Yeah, make sure that you enjoy them and you remember to take them, and I have no objection to that. I think that works great. I think but that's a good point, Karen, that if you have 3 or 4 or 5 bottles of different things, right, you might take 3 up to your bedroom and leave them, and then leave 2 to your kitchen, and then forget 2 one day and forget, you know what I mean? Like, just if you have a multivitamin and that tastes good, that you like, it's chocolate or gummy, like, Terry likes gummies, that's great. That's great. Just do that. Separate bottles will just increase the risk of forgetting, I think.
For sure.
Yeah.
And then, so Jenny had a question about, basically she heard about the virus being airborne in the past few days. Is there a difference between airborne and spread by droplets?
Yes, there's a big difference. Okay, so there is a paper that was released just yesterday that details, and I think there was a brief news, a video article about and coverage about the fact that so the 2 papers were released. One was about how long it lasts on cloth and on metal, and they actually definitively did the study and released the results, and that's all temperature dependent. So at 22 degrees Celsius, which is room temperature, it can last up to about 96 hours on metal, and then above 37 degrees Celsius, which is a hot summer day, it dissipates very, very quickly, so within 3 hours. But as it relates to aerosolization versus airborne, okay, let's talk about that. So can the virus survive not attached to anything? That means not attached to a water molecule, or a droplet, or any other form of, lighter than air particle, and float about in free space. That still has to be definitively determined. We do know very well that it clings to expectorant, right? So that expectorant is water-based, and that expectorant is found all over the naso and oropharynx, the wetness of your mucous membranes that start in your nose and go all the way down your throat. So any aerosolized form of that may contain a significant number of virus that then can cause transmission. All right, so we know that's absolutely true. Do we know that the virus can then hang out in the air, having escaped your nose and mouth without expectorant? We don't know that for sure. There are about 200 scientists who have petitioned the WHO to change their guidance to state that COVID is indeed airborne, like measles and some other virus that can actually hang out in a room, in room air at room temperature for hours to days. And anyone that enters that room is then under very high risk of contracting the infection. In my opinion, I do not believe that that is true for COVID. We are finding evidence that the number one form of transmission for COVID is indeed close proximity droplet-based transmission. The droplet size being ideally 3 to 5 nanometers, as we've described. That has enough virus in it that let's call it the dose. Okay, the dose of virus that if I'm standing across from, thank you. If I'm standing across from Karen and I'm having a normal conversation with her at normal volume in an enclosed space. So we're having coffee. We're sitting across a small dining table and we're having coffee. That's within 3 feet of each other. Okay, let's just generally. So within 3 feet of each other, there's enough dosage from my nose mouth expectorant into the proximity of her nose and mouth that through droplet, not air, through droplet, that she could get the infection. Okay. Again, let's cover this. If she's wearing a mask and I'm wearing a mask, it's minimized. Okay. If we're both not wearing masks, then it is an ideal transmission environment. If indeed it was airborne, then the mask would not be as useful. Okay. The mask would definitely not be as useful because then all the water droplets would be would be trapped by the mask, and air itself would then be flowing between Karen and I, and she could easily get the infection that way. But mask usage has been shown to definitively reduce the transmission of the virus, which then indicates that it is indeed droplet based and not airborne. It is aerosolized. I explained the hell out of that one. I hope I got.
Well, I mean, just for reference, last week I remember you talking about, because for most of us, 3 to 5 nanometers, is that what you say? Like that's really hard for us to visualize. You pointed out that when you look through, look at your window and you can see when there's light streaming into your window and you can see the dust, it's even smaller than that.
Yeah,
right?
So the aerosolized droplets are much, much smaller than those specks of dust. If those specks of dust are visible, imagine something 1/100th of that size that is not visible, that is indeed the kind of size that we're talking about. That's why packing into a venue that is an enclosed space, like a basketball stadium or something like that. Okay. And then
Political rally?
yeah, hey, there you go. Okay.
Okay.
And no one's wearing masks. That's just ideal. Okay. Because even if there's no, spittle and all this stuff, it's just even talking next to a person, 3 feet away from you, that is enough without masks. So that goes from this person to that person and that person to that person, all the way down, and across the venue. So that's why it's such a terrible, disease when it comes to the ease of transmission. And then obviously 40% of carriers being asymptomatic for up to 14 days is just like, if you were to engineer a bioterrorism, vector, this would be it. And now please don't go with the conspiracy theories that this was, I'm just saying that this
Terry, no conspiracy theories.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm just saying, this is just one of the techniques of one of the modes of transmission that is so scary about the virus is that it will go maybe to 10 or 15 different people and affect them minimally or not at all, and then land on person number 16 and kill them because they're 65, 75 years old,
I got a question, Sanjay.
What's that?
I said, with it becoming a higher infectability level, I'll go ahead and get the dogs.
Go ahead.
Does that change the R0 factor in it?
Good question. I would say that airborne infections versus aerosolized will have a much higher R0. But now what we discussed, I think maybe very early on, was that once you have mitigation in place and you have those, what is going on? Once you have mitigation strategies underway, R0 is no longer calculable. What you now have is R effective, okay? So once you put in these NPIs, these non-pharmaceutical interventions like physical distancing, mask usage, then you can no longer assess true R0, right? Only if nobody knows that this is happening and it's in a closed universe and you're watching it almost like an observer on an experiment, okay? Then you can calculate R0. And R0 is only useful once you have control of the infectious agent, like measles. Okay, so then you can really look at how a intervention like vaccination causes that to dissipate completely, like going from an R0 of 9 or 12 to less than 1 or 0, or approximating to 0. So, like for example, smallpox was eradicated by using this, to understand how transmissible it is, what is the level of immunity needed to deliver an effective 0 R0. And then when R0 is approaching 0, then you are approaching eradication. So we've switched over to calculating R effective now, and R effective is dropping. No, not in this scenario, not in COVID. R effective is calculated to be able to be dropping once you start to put in place these interventions. Okay, so now if you have a new mutation, right, then that changes again, because then you have different strains, and those different strains will have different R effectives. So let's call it the southern strain has an R effective that is much higher than what hit New York and the Northeast. All right, and so we're trying to figure out why the R effective has risen in the South, and one of the reasons scientifically is the molecular basis of the spike protein mutation causing it to be more transmissible. I hope that helped.
Yeah, I think it was a combination of mixing the COVID-19 with sunscreen, and
Yes.
you know we've got
That's,
this
yeah.
new strain going on.
Yeah, I have one for the post show for you on peppermint oil. It's a great
Oh,
one.
excellent! Yeah, I've heard something about this.
Yes.
But while we're
This is
going,
good.
can I, if I can, a quick question
Sure.
from Facebook. Antonio Pacina, I hope I said
Yes.
that correctly. I've researched metals that are less hospitable to bacterium and virus. I've actually purchased copper tape to wrap the area of my pencil or pen, paintbrush, whiteboard marker when I hold to write or paint. Advisable when wipes aren't available?
No, not really. Because obviously we know that copper less so, but definitely silver has antimicrobial activity. We know that it blocks certain in its atomic elemental form, it blocks certain pathways, and it causes either bactericidal, antiviral activity. But copper is definitely never going to be as effective as just wiping it down with an alcohol swab. Disinfectants like alcohol and bleach should still be readily available. So no, I wouldn't say that it's a good replacement for a normal chemical-based disinfectants at safe levels.
I just scored some bleach wipes, which I haven't seen in
Yeah.
forever. And I never, if you would have told me a few months ago that I would be excited about procuring some bleach wipes, I would have said you were crazy.
Yes, apparently that's one of. So here's what we'll eventually get to is if the supply chain gets disrupted even more severely than it was in the initial stages of the pandemic in the upcoming months. One after the other, one domino will cause this to just accelerate. So if we don't have, if PPE supply chain breaks down, if disinfectant supply chain breaks down, then the thing will just continue, it'll spiral out of control, right? So if hospitals, dental clinics, shopping places can't disinfect, and infection rates are inevitably will rise. So, one of the things that really scared me, not scared I would say, but startled me, was when Dr. Fauci and others like Dr. Satish Jha at the Harvard Institute for Public Health, talking about the possibility of us seeing 100,000, 120,000 positive cases detected per day in the United States. That, at its worst, we were at 25,000 cases per day in the Northeast. And now we've crossed into the range of 47 to 50,000 cases per day in the South. It is not improbable, nor is it at all impossible to see that double if control measures are not strictly implemented. So bleach wipes and alcohol could again become extremely rare. And 6 months now into this, and 16 weeks now for John and I, presenting this information to you now with Karen and Terry helping, it is a little bit disheartening, or maybe a lot disheartening, that we don't still have a national testing strategy. We don't still have a national supply chain strategy, nor perhaps even public and political will to end this massive burden on American society. So we're carrying the weight of a pandemic. We're leading the world in daily positives. We are leading the world in deaths, and yet our press secretary is calling what's happening the remaining embers of the COVID pandemic. I don't see how 50,000 cases a day can be described as embers. That's absurd. You know, it's absurd on its face. It's scientifically offensive. So if it's not going to be taken seriously, then maybe, you know, fear is a powerful motivator. Then maybe we need to start examining, like I said, I wanted to focus on in today's town hall, worst case scenarios. What does America look like with 100 or 150,000 new cases per day? How are 750,000 physicians, that's all we have, by the way. We only have 750,000 physicians in the United States, plus 3 million nurses. That's how many RNs we have. Okay. Plus all of their ancillary team members. That's pharmacists and all of the support staff. Okay. At that training level. How are we going to handle that? And the answer is we are not, because we've been handling it for the last 6 months, and many of us are tired. And I'm not a frontline clinician, okay? And I can't say that I'm tired at all. I'm not. I'm beginning to fear for them and their physical and mental health, because you can't do this week after week, month after month with no break. One of my Facebook friends, my kid, you know, he's got strong biostats and statistics background. He was carrying the flag for me on posting about COVID while I was in Facebook jail, and he said something that was really, really prescient, which is the current models assume that we can operate our hospitals at maximum capacity indefinitely. You can't run an engine at redline Terry, how long can you run an engine at redline, you know, without an oil change, without, you know, just fuel the damn thing and run it at 9,000 RPM?
Well, here's the thing. It all depends on the viscosity of the oil in the engine.
It does.
It does. No, and this is true. And once you rev it over a certain RPM, that oil will start breaking down.
Exactly.
There's no life left to it. The pistons will seize, and you'll shoot one through the roof of your car.
Exactly.
So that's what's going to happen to our healthcare.
Exactly.
10,000 in Texas.
It's well, you were overtaken by Florida, so.
Well, we're trying to keep up.
Yeah, you're in second place there.
You know, I wanted to play this, and this they mentioned the governor of Florida in this article, so I want to take a second and play a story that was on NPR earlier today, and I captured it. So let me see if I got to put this back up.
Okay.
I'm going to play this quick, and everybody else go on mute for a second.
At Goldman Sachs are warning analysts at Goldman Sachs are warning that the economic gains from reopening could now be in real jeopardy for June and July. They're pointing to a surge in new coronavirus infections, and NPR's chief economics correspondent Scott Horsley has been looking into this. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, David.
So I guess we do have some good news to cover this morning. The NASDAQ hit another high yesterday, and there's news that service-oriented businesses are seeing a pickup. That all sounds good. What are we making of that?
Right. It's another sign the coronavirus recession may have hit bottom and turned a corner. Last week we learned that manufacturing activity picked up in June after shrinking in March, April, and May. And now we know the much larger services side of the economy, that's everything from coffee shops and chiropractors to construction crews, are also starting to bounce back. The June rebound was faster and stronger than a lot of forecasters were expecting.
Well, then talk me through why we're getting these caution flags about the road ahead here.
The fear is that this comeback could be short-circuited by what's turned out to be a sharp jump in coronavirus cases in many parts of the country. Tim Quinlan is an economist at Wells Fargo Securities. He says if that happens, this kind of euphoric jump in service sector activity last month won't look so good in the rearview mirror.
A skeptic might reasonably argue that what's being captured here is the sugar high of a rushed reopening.
Already, some states have been forced to pause or even backtrack in their pushes to reopen businesses in hopes of getting a handle on the resurgent virus. And, you know, people who work in the services industry have been warning about that. One of the people who answered the survey on services last month said, the economy seems to be on the road to recovery, but let's not get too complacent. The person noted that COVID-19 is still a pandemic. There's no vaccine, and said you've got to be really careful and follow all the recommendations religiously if you want to run your business safely.
Well, Scott, I mean, we're seeing a spike in new infections in a good number of places around the country. Are we getting a sense so far of how consumers and how businesses are responding to these new increases?
In the hardest hit states, you can already see some decline in people's willingness to go out and spend money, and you can also see a decline in the demand for workers. Economists are tracking this with measures like mobility data from cell phone companies and workplace schedules from companies like Homebase. What looked to be a pretty robust recovery for consumer spending in the early part of June starts to stall out as the virus picks up speed. And as a result, the economists at Goldman Sachs have now lowered their forecast for economic growth in both July and August.
So are we going to see another round of lockdowns? I mean, just like the ones we had in March and April?
That would be one way to slow the spread of the virus, but it's obviously painful, and most policymakers want very much to avoid that. Goldman Sachs chief economist Jan Hatzius argues you could skip the shutdown and still achieve a similar reduction in new infections if the government simply ordered people across the country to wear masks when they're out in public. He says that would cut the infection rate more than 60% without the price tag of another lockdown.
Face masks are very effective in reducing virus spread. That would bring down the growth rate of confirmed virus cases significantly and reduce the need for what otherwise would be a significant hit to the economy.
It's obviously late, but Hatzius says it's not too late for a nationwide mask mandate. And he points to Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who finally did an about-face on masks last week and issued his own broad mandate as a sign that policymakers in this country are willing to adapt when circumstances require it.
So interesting, both a public health argument and an economic argument for face masks. NPR Chief Economics Correspondent Scott Horsley with us this morning. Scott, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, outstanding conversation. Very, very elucidating on many levels. What would it cost, and do we have the political and public will for another shutdown? Absolutely not. No, I don't think we couldn't afford it in any way, shape, or form. But the lesson from the first lockdown was that we threw away everything we gained from it, and we didn't do it the right way at all. There was no firm goal set that okay, we want. Nationally, we want everyone to be wearing masks if they have to go out in public. At the national level, we want our case count to come down to XYZ, okay? At the national level, we want our track and trace to accomplish A, B, and C, all right? So we left it to the states, and the states were all affected differently. And their timelines for being affected were different, so their approaches were all completely scattered, completely from one end to the other on the bell curve, right? New York had to go with the absolute strictest lockdowns, and while New York was suffering, Montana, Nebraska, and all these other states were suffering a national lockdown without a national strategy, while taking advantage of the fact that they had next to no cases. They should have taken advantage of the fact that they had next to no cases. Arkansas should have taken advantage of that fact. And all of these other states that were minimally affected during the initial development of hotspots should have done their utmost to protect their populations by implementing the exact same strategies nationally. And then we wouldn't be where we are right now.
Sanjay?
Yeah.
That quick history lesson is, first was spring break, which helped spread it out through the country.
Yeah.
And then Memorial Day was when it really started to take off in places.
Yeah.
And even the spike down here in the southern states, it's a continuation of what started from the Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where all control was lost.
Yeah. Again, this is really not, I'm trying very hard not to bring my politics into this. Dr. Zubin Damania he's a very charismatic guy who's been doing YouTube videos on biomedical topics. He does like YouTube music videos and stuff like that until, things got really serious, and he got really serious too, along with it. And now he shares along with others who are much more sophisticated when it comes to their production value. No offense to John. They, like Dr. Yogendra and Dr. Mike Hansen and others. It would be impossible. You could watch 3 years of his videos and you wouldn't be able to tell whether he was on the left or right politically. But even he is on a recent tear, so to speak, in his videos about mask usage and about how we have failed as a country compared to New Zealand and South Korea and others. And he's like, this has nothing to do with whether you're a Democrat or Republican. It has nothing to do with who you're voting for in November or, what your politics are. It has everything to do with being in a country that is being ravaged by a pandemic. And you can't sit on one side and say we're not being ravaged, and then on the other side, there's just no side to this. There's either you believe the numbers that of the people that have died, of the people who are and have been infected, of the people who are carrying morbidity and are struggling to recover from their infections for days, weeks, months. Either you believe these stories and these numbers, or you don't. And I think Fauci said, I can't tell you how to care for each other. There's no strategy for me to put in place that will make you care about each other. Okay? And caring about each other shouldn't change whether you're a Texan or a Floridian or a Pennsylvanian. We're fine in our state, screw Texas. That's not how this country or any country should work. When Italy was being, there was a firestorm of disease and death in Italy. Rome and the South came to the North's rescue. And when it headed south into Foggia, the North came to the South's rescue. And they acted like one nation. What are we doing? What are we doing? And the real problem here that we're seeing is you're putting further burden on, do you care about your healthcare system? Maybe you don't, okay? Maybe you just expect that if you roll into the ER, everybody's gonna be fresh from a nap. They're going to be loaded up with their vitamins, and they're all going to be smiling, and all their kids are happy at home and well taken care of, and they've got money in the bank. Everything's fine with everyone that's going to be taking care of you, from the nurse that triages you in the ER to the intensivist upstairs if you have to go to the ICU. All of them are going to be at tip-top performance because they're all well rested, well nourished, and happy and healthy. Guess what? They're not. They haven't been in months. And some of them are walking away. They're quitting, saying, I can't do this anymore. I haven't seen my kids in 7 weeks. Okay? So if you don't care about your healthcare system, if you don't care about these people and believe that they're human beings and they cannot operate at red line, despite the viscosity of their blood, I mean, you can't. You can't rely on the fact, you can't operate your national healthcare system or your state level healthcare systems at maximum and call that an ideal circumstance, an ideal situation. You just cannot. Sorry, I'm warning you, and I'm speaking on behalf of my brothers and sisters in the healthcare community that are blood, sweat, and tears, and 6 months into this. And some of them have taken their own life, which is why we have on our start screen, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline number. It's not just those who are at home and suffering fear and anxiety and depression as a result of this. There is fear and anxiety and depression ravaging the healthcare community and taking lives. And so if we want to protect them and ensure that any or all of us that ever have to avail of that system get the best care from the best rested and capable caregivers, then we got to look after them too. All right, so let's pause for questions, and then I'm going to go back to the slide deck and cover this mutation.
I do have 2 questions about antibodies.
Okay, sure, let's go with it.
Okay. How long do the antibodies remain? Are they readable after 3 months? Do they offer any protection with the virus mutating? That's from Catherine.
Okay, so we have covered a little bit of this in past weeks, if my colleagues here remember, but let's just go over this. If you take 100 people to get infected with COVID, about 40 of them will not develop antibodies. 60 of them will. Among those 60 people that develop the antibodies, and we'll get into why, they will have 2 classes of antibodies that develop. One is called IgM, and the other is called IgG. IgM develops in the initial infection. It is the sentinel antibody that calls the rest of the immune system into battle, and it rises quickly, and then it starts to come off in its levels quickly. I would say within 12 to 16 days after the initial infection. IgM then starts to rise. IgG then starts to rise. IgG is the type of antibody that stays with you and provides what's called as immune memory. Okay, it circulates in your bloodstream so that if you ever come in contact with the same infectious agent, it's there to bind with it and then call your immune system to it very quickly and take care of it, so that you don't. And this is what we rely on. This immune memory is what we rely on when we vaccinate. It is the development of IgG that gives you long-term immunity, and it's the development of IgG that even in COVID will give you immunity from reinfection. So the question was, how long will that immune memory or that protection last? In other coronaviruses, that protection will last between 18 months and 3 years. Okay, so depending on how what we call very effective immune response from IgG, we call it neutralizing. So if the IgG in your bloodstream as a result of a COVID infection is neutralizing, it's highly effective, then the immune memory will tend to be quite long. It'll be 2 to 3 years. If it is non-neutralizing, then it may not be as effective long-term. It may just be a short-term protection. Okay, so 12 to 18 months. So that's the range. That being said, the goal of the vaccine will be to provide IgG titer, or the amount of IgG necessary to protect you from COVID infection year to year, like we do with the flu vaccination. Okay, so it is more than likely that any COVID vaccine that we develop will not actually be a one-time and then maybe a booster in 10 years, like we've seen with some of our childhood vaccinations, measles, mumps, rubella, et cetera, where there's a very long, or polio and others, there's a very long-term immunity conferred from that vaccination. In this case, it may be that short-term vaccination is what is necessary to keep you safe from an infection or infectious agent that changes quite easily and quite fast, much like the flu changes from year to year. So different strains of flu have different infectivity. They also have different severity. COVID is likely going to become like that. It's likely going to be an endemic disease like flu. And so what we'll do eventually is develop a strategy to create a yearly vaccine that you will take to protect you from COVID. Will COVID have a season? We don't know, okay? COVID infection could be non-seasonal. It could be something that you can contract easily at any time of year, unlike the flu, which definitely has a season. We've seen it increase post-September through November, really being the key or height of the flu season. We don't know yet. It's brand new. We'll have to see. But we do know that the vaccine will be less effective if the mutations are rapid and significant. So if COVID mutates significantly this year, the vaccine that we produce this year against that strain will not be effective or not be protective for next year's emergence of COVID. Hope that helped.
Wow. Okay. Well, Jenny also had a question about antibodies. She was asking, is the T cell immunity picked up on any test?
Good question.
Even you can tell Jenny's in the medical field. Even without antibodies detected, could a person be immune based on T cells?
Yes. So that's an excellent question. And yes. So T cell immunity is different than B cell immunity, just to clarify Jenny's question. What I just discussed about IgG and immunoglobulin-based immunity is called humoral immunity. It is also called adaptive immunity, and it's also called immune memory, okay? So T cells are a different class of white blood cells, and they are the kernels. They are the, they're not the generals. They're at the front line, you know, but they call in all of the effort. They call in the effort to deal with an infectious agent. They call in natural killer cells. They call in macrophages. They even signal to other cells that are involved in immune response. And then a host of cell signals are a result of T cell involvement. So we call these cytokines. There's other names for them, but essentially T cells get involved early, and they can actually help to completely dissipate an infection, destroy an infection without calling in the humoral immunity, okay, the adaptive. So what we call a T cell response is also known as innate. Innate immunity involves complement in the blood stream, which is just a set of proteins that create a cascade and are able to neutralize certain infectious agents. Groot is calling me. This is about the time where I have to take a moment to bring him in. Excuse me.
So if any of us happen to come down with this and in our stupor we start talking about the kernels, we need the kernels to come.
So then you're gonna have to restate Jenny's question, but there is a strong hypothesis supported by what we know about innate immunity that and other viral infections that not all the cases of infection will it proceed to the requirement of IgG and IgM, IgG production. That in fact the T cells can do what's necessary to dissipate an infection before all of that, the rest of that happens. Now, and that also happens when you have an upper respiratory tract infection of COVID only. When COVID then descends to the lower respiratory tract, that's generally when we believe that all of the other humoral immunity signals kick in, and then you get all of that going on. Now, that's also the point at which other cytokines like INF interferon and interleukin-6 and other markers of acute infection start to rise, really fast. And then that's a signal that we have crossed over from T-cell immunity to other forms of immune response.
And I just want to point out that all of those things you mentioned, Sanjay, would make good band names.
They would make, yeah, interferon.
Yeah.
They would make great band names.
Hey, on the Facebook, Charles Bradshaw mentioned that a Ford healthcare rep brought up the H word with him, and I said, "Nope, not good. We have beat that horse." So we don't even talk about the H word. So
that's here. Okay, got it. Now that it's out, here we go. So Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, has tested positive for COVID after being a denier for months, and also having called it a hoax and all this other stuff. The initial request to his doctors from him was for him to begin a course of H word, and I just thought that was just hilarious and poetic. But anyway, we'll leave it at that.
And he's an older man too, isn't he? He's older.
He's a plus 60 plus, right? He's got to be
67.
Oh wow, okay. He looks young. He looks young.
Oh, I got 2 words: tots and pears.
Yes, tots and pears. We should send bulk tots and pears.
Tater tots and pears.
Yeah. So, okay. I hope Jenny's happy with that answer. If she has any follow up. Otherwise, I'm just going to go and give you some background here. All right. So, like I said, this mutation is underway, and it's not good. The basic morphology of the virus here, I've covered this before, but it's important to just get a picture before I start to talk about what's going on. So the spike protein is what is really making the virus stick to your ACE2 receptor. So your cells are covered in different receptors that do different things. And this is the basis of our understanding now of molecular medicine. So what receptor triggers what cascade or pathway within your cell that eventuates in the nucleus and your genetic material responding with the production of a protein, an enzyme, something structural, something that, a response, okay? So that response in your muscle cells could be to take up more glucose because of exercise or because of something else, that something comes along in your bloodstream, it attaches to a receptor in your muscle cell, and your muscle cell then gets the, begins a biochemical process in response to that. And it could be in response to insulin, it could be in response to glucagon or whatever. So there's thousands of circulating molecules that attach regularly to thousands of receptors of different shapes and sizes on your cells. And this is how the body controls all of the different complex processes of, regulating your body temperature, regulating your blood sugar, your blood pressure, so many aspects of your normal physiology are regulated through this pathway, this standard pathway of a receptor recognizing something in the bloodstream and then passing that information down into the cell infrastructure and the cell's infrastructure producing a response. Viruses hijack that mechanism. They hijack that machinery. So they come along and they, through a process of what we call biomimicry, they mimic a molecule that your body normally produces, whether it be a hormone or whatever, okay? So the spike glycoprotein of COVID is actually not attaching or going through your bloodstream to the ACE receptor anywhere in your body. It's actually getting to where it wants to go through your respiratory system. So a question came up about, well, what if, you have a cut and somebody sneezes on the cut, could you get COVID? And that's a great question, right? So the answer is very unlikely, because the innate immunity, which we just talked about, circulating T cells and all kinds of other innate immunity, are going to recognize that and kind of clear it out of the bloodstream before it has any opportunity to attach to anything and replicate. All right, so that's one great news. Somebody sneezes on an open cut, you can't actually really transmit it. So what you can, what it prefers it to transmit through is your respiratory system. So from one respiratory system to another, through aerosolized transport, on respiratory droplets, expectorant, this spike glycoprotein then enters your oropharynx and nasopharynx, and it finds a receptor on the surface of your cells in your respiratory architecture called ACE2, angiotensin converting enzyme number 2. And what this enzyme normally does is it converts a normal hormone called angiotensinogen to something that goes downstream and then regulates your blood pressure. Why is it all over your respiratory system? Well, that's a different lesson in med school. But all we know right now, or all you need to know right now, is that this is the mechanism for COVID to produce its infection. It's spike protein, that S protein that I showed you right here, attaches to the ACE2 receptor, and then it goes into the cell, which I'll show you in a diagram, and then it replicates itself. It replicates itself using a bunch of other weird proteins, okay? So M protein, hemagglutinin esterase dimer, envelope protein. It has a RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, which I don't have to explain. So all of this stuff is the architecture of the virus. And then what happens is, these are the common symptoms: headache, loss of smell, fever, dry cough, and fatigue are the absolute common symptoms. This is how you know that you may have contracted COVID. Is it will start with a dry cough, you'll feel miserable, and you'll feel very fatigued. And in the vast majority of cases, you will get a fever, okay? So vast majority being in 88% of all reported cases, people develop fever. Pathognomic means distinctive. Distinctive to COVID is a fever, generally starting above 100, starting above 99 and proceeding to above 101.8 or 102. Dry cough and fatigue. You just feel like crap and you start spiking a fever. Uncommon: bad headaches, loss of smell, nasal congestion, sore throat, cough, shortness of breath, pain in the joints, chills, nausea, vomiting, and in some cases, diarrhea. Then we have discussed this many times. 80% of cases will just have that, okay, at various levels of severity. 80% of the people will get over this without any repercussion, any morbidity. You won't, whatever. In 10 to 12%, more severe disease eventuates, and there'll be extreme malaise and sleepiness, confusion, COVID dreams, COVID nightmares, a bluish discoloration of the face and lips. Some patients will have a microarchitecture disruption in the lungs that will cause them to cough up blood, chest pain and chest tightness, decreased white blood cell count, acute kidney injury, and then a fever above 103.5. Okay, so these are the patients, that 10 to 12%, that you'll definitely see this kind of very severe, or some of these, one or more or many of these. And then 6 to 8% will need supportive care, and hospitalization. And of those 6 to 8% that end up in the hospital, right now, 1.5% will die. This is COVID in a nutshell, okay? And so it all starts with that little virus and its little spike protein. And what goes on here, well, what we're seeing is, this is the world daily count. There is no baseline. So baseline used to be down here, okay? This is baseline, right? There is no return to baseline, which means there's no control. We've heard in the news that there's a spike in the initial period of time that's known as the first wave. Then it will return to baseline, and then for various reasons you can see a resurgence. And in the pandemic of 1918, the second spike was much worse than the first. So the second wave was much worse than the first. We don't know anything about the molecular biology of that infectious agent back then. We know a lot about it now, but was there a mutation that caused transmissibility to increase? What were the geosocial changes of spread, et cetera, that caused the second spike to be larger? All of those are question marks. But the odd thing about this first wave for the world right now, and in the United States especially, is there's no real return to baseline. Actually, there's no return to baseline. There is a initial flattening, and a plateau has been achieved. Last week, I showed you this picture of the stiff and floppy. Still makes me laugh like a 12-year-old. And what was unknown was, and here's this very same slide that I showed you last week. This is the mutation of interest. These are all the other mutations we've detected, okay? So we've detected all kinds of other mutations, but this one is the mutation of interest, D614G. This is causing, and these are the locuses from where we have found the genetics, the genomics of the virus has changed, leading to the development of these proteins, shapes changing. So we found that this D614 is the reason, and this is specifically at the bonded, the chemical bond level, that causes part of it to actually become able to bind to your ACE receptor more easily. And here comes the scary part. It changes. It can actually, it changes in a way that allows it to, even if it's been neutralized by antibodies, okay? Once it enters the cell, if it finds a way to enter the cell, and I'll talk about why it's able to do this, even if it has antibodies attached to it. Once it enters a pH that's different from extracellular, it changes in a way that it can release those antibodies, right? So if you see in this picture, sorry, it's being tackled by antibodies here, right? But there's some spike that was able to attach to ACE2, see that, okay? And then because it was able to attach to ACE2, it was taken inside of the cell, inside of mucus cell, epithelial cell in the respiratory mucosa, and it creates a little bubble for itself called an endosome. And this is where it begins its nastiness. In this endosome, the pH changes, and it goes from, which is what's normally 7.4, to a lower pH, a more acidic pH. And in that acidic pH, it's able to let go of those antibodies can no longer bind to it. One of its tricks, okay? So what does that mean? That means that even if you had those initial antibodies that were neutralizing and effective, if they weren't at the appropriate levels, if they weren't strong enough in their binding energy, it can actually bypass that initial immune response. It can bind as a result of that change in its conformation, the change in its, the mutation that we just saw that I described for you. It can bind your ACE receptor once, It can bind it the same molecule can bind it twice, or it can bind it 3 times. So it can bind weakly, more strongly, and extremely strongly. And then based on, once it's taken inside of the cell, it can let go and begin its replication cycle very easily.
Is one of the mutations found in a certain geographical area versus
Right
the
now,
other?
excellent question. Right now, we suspect that the southern and western infections are being driven by this new strain. This new mutation is responsible for the very high levels of transmission. And like I talked about during the example of Karen and I having coffee, if I had the original strain from New York, Karen and I would have to talk for an hour for me to give her enough virus from my droplets for her to carry the infection. Now that could be as short as 3 to 5 minutes. We could just have a 3 to 5 minute conversation, and because of the change in conformation of the spike protein of the virus that's now prevalent in the South and the West, it's easier to transmit. And that's also why we're probably seeing extremely high levels of case positivity recently. Okay, and we covered this last week, but I don't think we need to do that. This is showing you, we've done this before, about when the tests are relevant. The tests are relevant in detection about 2 weeks prior to something, you feeling sick, about within the first 4 to 10 days after exposure, there will be a rise in the viral titer in your nasal and oral pharynx. Okay, and that's detectable on the swab test that John had done 2 weeks ago and was negative at Rite Aid. That was negative because he wasn't exposed. But if your person was exposed, then 4 to 10 days later, this is the rising titer, and then it'll hit a threshold titer or a threshold level of viral replication that you will start feeling sick. One of those symptoms will start happening, okay? Fever, malaise, cough, whatever. And then the disease progresses. Your IgM levels, see here, the purple, they begin to rise about 10 days after, 10 to 12 days after symptom onset, and then they rapidly drop off. By the 6th to 8th week, they're barely detectable, but they are detectable long term if they are IgG antibodies. They stay with you and they provide the protection. Okay, so this is how you read this graph. So this is the time period right here when the nasal swab is going to tell you whether you've been exposed, and it's up here in your it's detectable in your nasopharynx, and that's where the virus is right now. Once the virus gets to a certain level, you'll feel sick. If your innate immunity and your T cells are strong enough to fight it off, then you'll just have it for a while. It'll be detectable, and you'll never proceed to the full-blown COVID symptomatology. And during that time that your T cells are fighting off the infection and you don't feel any symptoms, which could be as long as 14 days, you could be spreading it, which brings us back to why we need to all wear masks. Okay? All right, so trimodal therapy and all the crazy science, we've covered this before. Last week I was asked whether there is an actual protocol. There is a protocol. Here it is. If there are any questions, we can cover that. Some bad news on famotidine, which is the active ingredient in Pepcid. The guys at Northwell released their study, and it looks like famotidine does not help. So Pepcid in the clinical setting in hospitalized patients has not been very effective in especially elderly patients and especially the most sick. Very, very mild reductions for others. So not statistically significant and not very useful. So probably not the one that we would recommend. Now, we've been talking about nifomostat from very, very beginning, and we should have data on nifomostat shortly. Biomarkers. So biomarkers are things that we hunt for or look for in your blood that will tell us certain things about your condition. So we talked last week about D-dimer and CRP being elevated, and they indicate two different things. D-dimer indicates that you are getting that typical COVID clotting problem, so microcoagulopathy. The other indicator is CRP, which is C-reactive protein, which is an indicator that you're getting close to the cytokine storm, and that highly inflamed immune response that's called cytokine storm. So here are the other things that they're kind of tracking. What is it that could really be giving us an indication that someone could be headed the wrong way? One of them is new. I don't know if anyone's using it yet. It's called glycoprotein acidyls, and these are seen in chronic inflammation, but also in severe acute inflammation. Right now, whatever. This is all just whatever. But what's important is we now know to track patients to see whether they're beginning the clotting and whether they're beginning the inflammatory phase of COVID. Those are the tests that are being utilized to really tell us if a patient is headed in the wrong direction. So all of this stuff we've covered before. And so.
I still have a question from Madeline.
Yes, Madeline.
Madeline said that she has seen numerous articles about marijuana CBD protection from COVID-19.
Yeah, I don't know yet, but I've been getting information from friends as well. Again, we have a very complex endocannabinoid system. The Vascular Biology Working Group, which is an international body led by nephrologists and cardiologists, have studied an endogenous cannabinoid receptor system that is present, like I just described before. We've got thousands of different receptors that do thousands of different things. Oddly enough, our body has naturally developed receptors for cannabinoids. Now, cannabinoids are, naturally occurring in marijuana in the form of tetrahydrocannabinoid and cannabidiol and whatever. There are various versions of it. And they have a number of different effects on the body. Like, obviously they do, right? We all know this. Many are positive effects, and they have not been adequately studied. So we don't have enough data to know, well, if endocannabinoid receptor number 1 and number 6 and number 9 and whatever, what is the cascade and pathway that they eventually activate? And cancer researchers are now doing this all over the world. They're trying to figure out what if we give highly concentrated, CBD, THC, whatever, or some modified version of those that will allow it to cross certain barriers or et cetera. What would it do to certain cancerous like solid tumors or even bloodborne cancers and things like that? For decades, especially in this country, research has not been funded by the federal government because of the stigma associated with marijuana, and that it is a illicit drug and all this other stuff. It's a naturally occurring, potentially, or I would say definitely, not just potentially, definitely medicinal agent. And so we should probably investigate using randomized control trials and our usual scientific rigor, whether it has antiviral effect and how that antiviral effect occurs at the molecular level. Again, if you're going to ask Sanjay about whether or not something works, you're going to have to show Sanjay pictures of like I just showed you, okay? I want to see the alpha helices, and I want to see the beta pleated sheets, and I want to see the ligands and the receptor binding domains. And you got to show me, you know, energy of activation and all that stuff. Okay, molecular medicine in a molecular medicine era needs to come with all of that evidence for me to find it acceptable. So that being said, I hope we do put some effort into that kind of research, and if it does have strong antiviral effect, let's find a way to use it.
17-year-old Terry would have convinced you that it was all right.
How old was I?
I would have passed you a 3-foot graphics bong, and you know we would have discussed it. So
I was waiting for a joke from you. I was
26-year-old Sanjay.
it was no joke.
Terry
at 17 was definitely a believer. Now I have a CDL. I can't even smell this stuff without failing a drug test. So
yeah, I've got 2 more dogs at the door. I'll be right back. Discuss among yourself.
This is where John gets up and dances. You know, I gave that guy who was standing behind you, John, with the mask hanging down, I gave him such a hairy eye that he turned back and looked at your screen again.
I yelled at him. I'm like, what are you doing? What are you doing?
I totally leaned down like this as he was looking at your screen.
Sorry, guys. So anyway, yeah, so that's what I've got so far this week. I mean, I could talk about, you know, the doomsday scenarios, but I think it's all pretty clear, right? Like you could start school, and if you don't have a strategy in place, then the children's school could get disrupted months into the beginning of their school year, and then what happens? You know, that it's awful. These are awful scenarios.
I give it 6 weeks.
Our food supply could get disrupted. Our medical supplies could get disrupted. Relax.
I'm fascinated by hearing that some people are surviving, but they have developed diabetes.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's the same mechanism of action that we believe is the cause of type 1 diabetes. So an autoimmune reaction and response that destroys the islets of Langerhans cells in the pancreas. So it goes and destroys the cells that actually produce insulin, and then you are diabetic. There was a question about neurodegenerative effects, and there's a paper on high circulating autoantibodies post-COVID infection in cerebrospinal fluid. This is a weird bug. This is a weird bug. And it has a lot of biomimicry involved, a lot of crossover of genes that not genes, but genetic or genomic behavior that we see in other viral species. There was a question of, there was a news article, because science news has got to be weird, right? You can't, it's not interesting if it's not weird. So nobody will read it. The cells being infected develop philopodia, right? Did you see that one?
Yeah, I did.
You know, the little fingers start projecting protrusions from the cells, and they go looking for other cells. We've seen this in RSV, respiratory syncytial virus. Dengue does this, okay? There's a lot of cross-reactivity between dengue antigens and COVID antigens. There are 3 genes that it hijacks in the cell that cause it to create, the cell makes it start creating these little protrusions. The protrusions are to help it infect the next cell. Okay, so viruses do this. We know that they do this, that they hijack the machinery of the cell so that they can create these opportunities to infect the cell next door, and the one next door, and the one next door, and just fill the entire respiratory system with opportunities for replication.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Since you're a numbers guy,
Yes.
in going about figuring out the how fatal this virus is, I go back to I looked up the numbers off of Johns Hopkins yesterday, and I was particularly interested in the recovered numbers and the death rate, or the people who died at 130 and then 1,000, and then the recovered is 900,000. Why isn't the death rate figured off of those two numbers as opposed to, because that would put it at about 12% of the people who are done with this virus have died from it?
That's a good question. Now, I think, so I keep stressing that case fatality rate, which is calculated as a crude measure, right? Boys, as a crude measure, it is just your total number of cases that you have positive, that have come back with positive result. And then in the numerator, you have the number of deaths, right? Now, that in some regions of our country is as high as 11%. In New York at its height, it varied, but it was as high as 14%. It's just such a crude measure of, and it has so many variables that, so you have a valid, the funny thing is you have a valid death count, right? At least we assume that all of the deaths attributed to COVID are accurately attributed to COVID. Then you have a valid denominator that states these are all the people that tested positive for COVID, and you assume that there's very little error, that the rate of error in that denominator is small, 1 or 2% maximum at max, right? So how is it that can then belie so many other confounding issues? That's a completely different discussion. That's why I avoid it altogether. That's why the case fatality rate is something that the media uses, and it's a somewhat inaccurate picture of what's going on. All right. That being said, I think that mortality rate is very important to look at. Mortality rate is the patients who are addressing or seeking their care addressed within a healthcare system. All right. So they enter with all of the symptomatology that's pathognomic of COVID. Not all. The symptomatology that's pathognomic for COVID. High fever, cough, malaise. Okay, they get tested, they get admitted, they go through a course of treatment, and they either survive, as you just mentioned, Terry, their survival, right? They survive and they get discharged. Their discharge record shows they were discharged on such and such date, having been admitted at such and such date, and their length of stay was so long, and they are now recovered and considered recovered and sent home, okay? Then you take the number that didn't leave, right? They didn't leave, and their discharge certificate or their discharge disposition is death.
Yeah.
All right. So with that number in mind, then you are calculating true mortality. All right. But true mortality for only those who availed of our healthcare system.
But
right? So there's a huge discrepancy.
Here in our town, they track, or up until the numbers have been going crazy, they were doing a good job of tracking. And one of the statistics, they would put at home, at the hospital. Mm-hmm. They had it that well going on. I don't know if I trust those numbers anymore with the way the numbers are going. But, if someone were to die at home, the number would come off of someone, being homebound from it. So say the town had 40 people at home with COVID, and someone were to die at home, that number would come down and it would go into the death column and leave. So they were doing a good job up to that point. I was just curious at looking at the numbers on John Hopkins, how we go about, and you hear the 1% or, you know, that's the number that anti-maskers love to grab, you know.
Right. No, I totally agree with you. And so, no, I completely see that too. I mean, I've had people say to me, well, we've had 130,000 deaths out of 330 million people. So the death rate is actually 0.000693%.
Yeah. Or someone
Like, what kind of math is that, man? I mean,
yeah, or they try and say it's, you know, point.
only 130,000 people have died out of 330 million. So it's not a deadly disease. Okay, man. I mean, at what point do you just turn around and walk away from that argument? Here's a great question from
I just deleted them out of the group they were in on Facebook. That's all I did. I said, I could go get those numbers for you, or I could kick you out. And so I would kick them out.
But it's like, yeah, exactly. And it's like saying, okay, well, only 3,360 people died on 9/11 out of 330 million people. So it wasn't really a serious terrorist attack.
Yeah.
Okay. Like, I mean, it's I don't know what to say. It's obscene.
So
obscene. The word that comes to mind is obscene. The second word is obnoxious. And that because I mentioned this a while ago that I'm not a racist, but has been replaced with every life lost to COVID is important. But I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it has replaced that almost. It's like we can't, if we as a society, and we clearly we're beginning to realize that we don't value our fellow citizens' lives like New Zealanders do, like South Koreans do, like Italians do, like Spanish do, like
we don't.
Okay, so okay, we have to admit that then, because then let's drop the pretenses. Okay, then it is very clear that other things are much more important to us as a society than each other's lives. Yeah. All right, because that's how we're acting. Okay, this whole Swedish herd immunity experiment, we're actually living it more than the Swedes are.
Yeah,
at this point.
And it's just as impossible here as it is there. Yes. I tried to explain this to someone today that if your immunity is only going to last up to 2, maybe 3 years, and this thing in 6 months has infected 1% of the population here, how do you expect to get herd immunity every year when a new strain comes through?
No,
it's not going to happen.
It's a complete fallacy. Jenny Shortell has a very interesting question related to these numbers. Opinion of lead time bias in relation to touting that our death rate has come down. Lead time bias, I can help you I'll try to define it. Is it possible that we are catching cases earlier, making the lagging mortality numbers further lag behind case detection? I would say that, one of the major confounding factors, before I can even answer that, from a biostatistics perspective, is that the quality of data collection is not uniform. All right. So if the quality of data collection is not uniform, then we would have to look at an individual state to say, based on their protocols for data collection, testing, or sorry, I should say, testing, detection, data collection, analysis, and then reporting. Based on that, their standards, then there is lead time bias involved or not. Nationally, it's so almost impossible. So if I try to mix Florida's data collection and reporting with Pennsylvania and New York's and other states that have a different standard of what is a COVID death and what is not, then there's no way to say. There's just no way to compare. It's totally apples and oranges. Not only that, we have states that are actually hiding their mortality numbers.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree.
So then everything is thrown out the window because your endpoint is completely obscured and completely imprecise. So
the outbreak of pneumonia in Florida is like incredible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, huge amounts of pneumonia in Russia right now. Huge amounts of pneumonia.
Russia and Florida.
Florida, oddly enough. And so these are the things that you won't be able to really talk about. Whether, can we just please have someone write down a one-page protocol for how to for how every state must report in? Why are we having Johns Hopkins be a surrogate for our own CDC? Don't we all pay taxes for our CDC to do this work?
The CDC was going to do that, but then a big taco order came in and they had to put it off. They're getting some burritos ready and for a drive-through order.
So this is what I'm talking about. If we don't have a solid basis for how we collect our data and how we normalize it and how we report it and how we use it, we've done what, 30? John, let's bring it up. Let's do the. Okay, share screen. Here we go. Share this. All right, newly confirmed cases. Oh, look at this. This is horrible. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, so we hit almost, what, 47, it'll tell me if I hold on. 49,344 cases confirmed yesterday. So we've shot past everyone on daily confirmed cases. Let's see how many tests we did. Johns Hopkins. USA. Look at this. This is horrible.
Oh, Jenny had a comment about the data coming out of Georgia. She said, unless COVID is listed as cause of death, it isn't counted. Contributing factor isn't good enough. Close to real numbers here can only be estimated by looking at excess pneumonia, renal, and
yeah. So they're doing this, like Terry mentioned, they're doing the same thing in Georgia as they're doing in Florida. So they were telling us how many tests they were doing.
Georgia stopped testing for the holiday weekend because COVID knows it's a holiday weekend. It's a very smart virus.
It did go to the beach on Sunday, so.
The floppy or the stiff?
Yeah, yeah, it's the floppies. So, yeah, we've got a lot of bad things happening. I can't find how many tests we did. I don't know where that's listed right now, but anyway, these are not good. None of these are good. Arizona, normalized by population, is the one with the fastest growing percentage positives. Then Florida, then South Carolina, then Louisiana, then Texas. It's all in the South, all of it. Percentage positives is really now the new metric. So once you hit a testing level that ensures coverage of potentially all potential positives, like we have. So congratulations to the United States for finally providing enough testing to get a good grip on what's happening in various states. But even with that, I'm hearing that people are being denied tests. I don't know why, I have no idea why. Why would you be denied a detection test at this point? Even if it doesn't make any sense.
How about getting your results back 2 weeks later?
Yeah, that's ridiculous too, right?
So I had heard that in Texas that you're charged $200 for a test. Now, I was able to receive a test a few weeks ago for free, so I'm confused by...
It depends on where you go.
Okay.
If you go to one of the testing sites, which the feds kept open after some serious blowback when they announced they were shutting them down. But when you go to a CVS or Walgreens, or you're going to incur some cost, which, you know, may or may not be covered by insurance. It's just how it is. They don't, you know, just because you're sick doesn't mean you can't cough up some cash, you know?
Yeah. So, do we have any other questions? Anybody facing? I have two stories I could tell real quick. One is Walter's Hardware Store in Wilkes-Barre is a family-owned business, and I've been there now 3 times in the course of the last couple of months, and they have a mask policy on the door. You do not enter without a mask on. All the staff are masked, and it's busy. Not super busy. It's busy for a family business, and they're doing well. They're doing fine through this. They are strict. So I actually saw the proprietor, who works the cashier, stop a woman from coming in who had no mask on, and they are working their full shifts with a mask. I was there for almost 35 minutes today, because there were other customers that were waiting for help, and I was just perusing, and they had their masks on the whole time. So proud to say, here in Northeastern Pennsylvania, there are family-owned businesses. There are businesses that are doing okay and that are strictly enforcing the mask requirement. Second story I have is signed my kids up for a camp here in the Back Mountain. As I just told you, we went from being a hotspot to now, yesterday was 2 confirmed cases in our entire county. So we are a low prevalence, low incidence county now. We're green, right, John? Are we green? Yeah, we're green. And so most businesses, if not all, are open, and camp has been allowed to open, and that's great news for the boys, because they're looking forward to seeing their friends and stuff like that. Problem is, there's nothing else going on. The kids have no other travel or other plans or anything that they would be doing. So the line to get in was scary. I mean, to just drop off. We got there early, and then as I was leaving, I couldn't believe how many kids are coming into camp. Now, all the camp counselors are wearing masks. They're asking as many of the older kids, who can tolerate wearing a mask and effectively wear it properly, to wear one. I saw some of the younger, 6-7-year-old kids even wearing a mask, but there were the young that have more kind of a daycare style camp. They weren't. I don't know how to feel about that. I don't know yet, but we're going to see it, right? We're months away from going back to school.
One thing they had on us back in 1918 is you would just ship the kids off to their job at the coal mines.
Exactly.
And then you didn't worry about it.
Yes.
Maybe black lung, but
which might have been protective, actually, right? Black lung.
Nice coating of coal in your lungs to to keep the.
It's funny. I was on a call with the consulting group that I was with, and we did a team happy hour, virtual Zoom happy hour, and someone was talking about the people that they knew who contracted COVID-19, and was saying how somebody who was the heaviest smoker has serious symptoms. We had talked a while ago about how those people who have black lung or tar in their lungs are not, the virus can't grab hold, so they're not going to necessarily have as serious symptoms, and it just blew the mind of these brilliant consultants across the country. And then they're like, well, why did I quit smoking almost years ago? I said, for other health reasons. But,
I like Karen's math. Very nice.
But we are at almost 2 hours, if we're not over 2 hours.
Yeah, we can close out and go to the post show.
So we are going to go to the post show once I hit the button to do so, which is not very good. Yay. We will likely, I guess, unfortunately, kind of be back next week with another town hall. We are, like I said, we are 16 and can drive. If we make it another 5 weeks, we can drink Sanjay. We'll be at 21 weeks.
Exactly.
Is that how that works? I don't know if that's how that works, but that's how we're going to say it works. Our thanks to Terry Munt, Gary Hirsch, on behalf of Dr. Sanjay Joshi and myself, Sean Bell, we want to thank you for joining us tonight. Stick around for the post show for those of you who are watching on Zoom. If you are not watching on Zoom and would like to, the link is in the comments on the Facebook live streams. So we will open that up in just a second. Have a great night, everyone.